I'm Shanaz Weiss with Iraq Matters, an epic podcast of news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq. We are now the #1 podcast on Iraq, reaching more than 2,100 downloads since we began podcasting. Some interesting metrics. Within the U.S., 75% of our downloads are from the great states and territories of California, Virginia, New York, D.C., Massachusetts, Florida, Illinois, and Texas. Woohoo! Outside of the U.S., our largest audiences are in Iraq, Canada, South Korea, UK, Japan, and Australia. Shukran and zor spas, dear listeners. Become a part of the #1 podcast on Iraq. If your organization or business is interested, email us at info@epic-usa.org. For this week, we're dedicating our show to Veterans Day. EPIC Director Erik Gustafson, a veteran of the 1991 Gulf War, talks for the 3 Iraq War veterans about their service in Iraq, about their continuing sense of mission, and about their hopes for Iraq's future. As a special update following Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's visit to Washington, D.C., we feature our first Iraq Matters commentary on the situation in Iraq and our recommendations for President Obama. But first, a campaign update. Our petition on change.org has reached more than 7,500 signers, moving us 3/4 of the way toward our goal of 10,000 signatures. If you're not already one of our awesome petition supporters, please join us in urging the Obama administration and Congress to do more to support renewed diplomacy and humanitarian action for peace in Iraq. You can sign and share our campaign with friends at www.iraqmatters.org. Monday, November 11 is Veterans Day. As you've been following, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's recent visit to the United States marks the beginning of a renewed effort towards U.S.-Iraqi relations and has brought the most pressing issues in Iraq to the Obama administration's attention. With that in mind, here's our first Iraq Matters commentary.
From the old railway depot in Swamp Poodle, Washington, D.C., this is EPIC Director Erik Gustafson with our first Iraq Matters commentary. Shortly after the departure of the last U.S. troops from Iraq nearly 2 years ago, President Barack Obama and Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki held a joint press conference. At that event, President Obama welcomed the Prime Minister as the elected leader of, quote, Iraq's most inclusive government yet. Mr. Obama declared, "We're here to mark the end of this war." That final remark may have held some truth at the time, but nearly 2 years later, President Obama's legacy of responsibly ending the war in Iraq is at risk. Right now, violence in Iraq has reached levels not seen since the height of Iraq's civil war from 2006 to 2008. So far this year, the UN reports that more than 7,500 Iraqis have lost their lives in violence, mostly civilians, like the headmaster and 14 children who were killed last month when a suicide bomber attacked a primary school in Tel Afar, northern Iraq. Yes, you heard me correctly. He drove a truck packed with explosives into a playground of a primary school, killing 14 children and the school's headmaster. What accounts for the dramatic escalation of violence? In a recent op-ed in the New York Times, Prime Minister Maliki painted a picture of an Iraq that has largely become the victim of circumstances outside his government's control. Specifically, he blamed a spillover of militants and weapons from Syria's civil war, and a reconstituted al-Qaeda in Iraq and other extremists engaged in a renewed campaign to foment sectarian violence and division. According to him, the solution? A deeper security relationship with the U.S., including the purchase of more U.S. weapons and a greater sharing of intelligence. Already as of June of this year, Iraq has purchased more than $14 billion in U.S. weapons, services, and training for its military and security forces. That includes 18 F-16 fighters, which are scheduled to be delivered next year. Under the U.S. Foreign Military Sales Program, which is subject to congressional oversight, Iraq is seeking to purchase a second set of F-16s and has stepped up requests for Apache attack helicopters, Hellfire missiles, Predator drones, and a range of other weapons. The picture painted by Mr. Maliki, however, is only part of the story. Here's what he gets right. Al-Qaeda's Iraq-based affiliate, AQI, which currently calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, or the Levant, is back and quite possibly stronger than ever. In military terms, common measures of an enemy's strength are 1, the number, scale, and sophistication of their operations, 2, their numbers and rate of recruitment, and 3, their control of territory. On all 3 measures, AQI has regained capabilities not seen since their previous peak of operations in 2006 and 2007. And as well documented by Jessica Lewis of the Institute for the Study of War, they can operate from the southern Iraqi port city of Basra to coastal Syria. Even the once safe haven of Iraq's Kurdistan region has not escaped harm. To illustrate the increasing scale and sophistication of AQI's operations, consider the following. In July, al-Qaeda-affiliated militants simultaneously attacked Iraq's Taji and Abu Ghraib prisons and nearby military divisions. The most successful of the attacks was on the notorious Abu Ghraib prison, freeing more than 500 inmates, including Abdul Rahman al-Balawi and other convicted senior members of al-Qaeda in Iraq. According to Michael Knights of the Washington Institute, in 2010, there was a multi-city synchronized bombing attack every 4 months. Now, one occurs every 10 days. In late September, AQI attacked the headquarters of the Kurdistan Regional Government's Security Services, or ASAYESH, in Erbil, the first terrorist attack in that city since 2007. Due to the number and tempo of such operations, Iraq's National Army is stretched thin and unable to cover all of the areas where AQI is active. The Economist reports, quote, Iraq's security forces have withdrawn from key cities in Anbar, such as Fallujah and Ramadi, and from a mainly Sunni area in the neighboring province of Salahuddin. Just this week, the mayor of Fallujah was assassinated. It is time to sound the alarm. After all, we are not just talking about violence, we are talking about atrocities. As noted by Haider al-Houhi of Chatham House, today in Iraq, the overwhelming majority of violence is being carried out by al-Qaeda-affiliated militants, and not by militias as we saw during the height of sectarian violence in 2007. And while AQI would like to characterize itself as a protector of the Sunnis, their victims include Sunnis and Shia alike, as well as religious minorities, youth in cafes, protest organizers who they deem as not being sufficiently radical enough, tribal leaders who resist giving them a carte blanche in their territories, and as previously mentioned, primary school children. But wait, isn't the war over? In fact, didn't General Petraeus just pen a long piece about, quote, how we won the war in Iraq? Indeed, during the so-called surge, al-Qaeda in Iraq was nearly defeated by a combination of U.S. counterinsurgency operations, the Sahwa or Awakening movement led by the late Sheikh Abdul Sadr Abu Risha and other tribal leaders, and the mobilization of the Sons of Iraq militias across Anbar, Salahuddin, and other areas that had previously tolerated the presence of foreign militants. But the long-term follow-through, particularly on the political front, to make those gains permanent, never came to fruition, as political rhetoric triumphed over common sense. That brings us to the part of the picture that was missing in Mr. Maliki's op-ed. By all indications, the lessons of what worked in 2008 are not being applied to the situation in Iraq today. That point was underscored in a recent letter to President Obama by 6 senior senators, including the chairs and ranking members of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The senators wrote, quote, as the United States learned from its own hard experience in Iraq, applying security solutions to political problems will only make those problems worse. Yet that message does not appear to have been received in Baghdad. In fact, during Prime Minister Maliki's visit to Washington, D.C., when he met with 2 of the letter's authors, namely Senators Robert Menendez and Bob Corker, the chair and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the meeting was described by the senators as, quote, extremely disappointing. It felt like we were talking past each other, said Senator Corker. This raises the prospect that the U.S. senators will exercise their oversight powers to block the sale of U.S. weapons and other forms of security assistance if, quote, Mr. Maliki continues to marginalize the Kurds, alienate many Shia, and treat large numbers of Sunnis as terrorists. However, as the letter also states, quote, if he devises and implements a real governance strategy for Iraq, the United States is prepared to provide the appropriate support. The need for Baghdad to make a course correction is urgent. According to a veteran foreign aid worker quoted in the current issue of The Economist, at the moment, what fuels the conflict the most is the presence of central government security forces in Sunni areas, where they arrest young men in the hundreds, torture them, and then release them after money is paid. You can see al-Qaeda benefiting from the heavy-handed presence of the armed forces. Earlier this year, blogger Joel Wing of Musings on Iraq rightly observed that Iraqi security forces are making the same mistakes that the Americans made in the early years of the war. So what can the Obama administration and Congress do to encourage Baghdad to pursue, as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Brett McGurk put it, a more holistic approach to fighting terrorism and promoting peace? EPIC has 5 recommendations. First, press Prime Minister Maliki's government to do more to stop the flow of funds, militants, and weapons fueling both sides of Syria's civil war. And that means doing more than just stopping those overflights. Perhaps most critically, the U.S. and international community should demand that Mr. Maliki allow a full restoration of the transparency and independence of Iraq's central bank. Every day that institution is allowed to remain opaque, untold volumes of Iraq's foreign cash reserves are being used or at risk of being used to prop up al-Assad's regime, either directly or via Tehran. Second, don't lose sight of the humanitarian and protection needs of vulnerable and displaced Iraqis, Syrians, and other vulnerable populations in the region. 3 million Iraqis remain displaced, and escalating violence is adding to those numbers, contributing to a regional humanitarian crisis that includes more than 7 million Syrians fleeing internal violence, including 2 million Syrians, mostly children, who have fled to neighboring countries. Right now, nearly half of Syria's population is in need of humanitarian assistance. And in Iraq, despite the country's oil wealth, a quarter of the population lives below the poverty line. As U.S. Assistant Secretary Ann Richard rightly put it, the U.S. and international community must redouble their efforts to avert the threat of a lost generation of children. Third, require Mr. Maliki to address the legitimate demands of Iraqi protesters. These protesters are making reasonable demands. They are calling for the abrogation of Article 4 of the counterterrorism law that allows people to be imprisoned on accusations without evidence or trial. They want the release of prisoners held without charge and those who have served their terms but remain in detention. They want improvements in public services and an end to corruption, especially corruption in the security sector, where militants continue to find ways to bribe their way past checkpoints and access Iraqi security forces' uniforms and equipment. Fourth, reverse the precipitous cuts in U.S. assistance. As was reasonable to expect, U.S. Iraq spending was substantially reduced following the 2011 troop withdrawal. However, proposed U.S. spending on Iraq for fiscal year 2014 is dangerously low. Keep in mind that we're not talking about funds for U.S. troops on the ground. That's no longer part of the equation. We're talking about vital funds for cost-effective diplomacy and targeted assistance in areas that are critical for Iraq's peace and development. To name just a few examples, the President's FY 2014 budget proposes 70% to 95% cuts in U.S. funding for peace building, human rights, and civil society. Accompanying those proposed cuts are reports that USAID is scheduled to leave Iraq in 2014. Budget pressures are also forcing a key office of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad that liaisons with Iraqi security agencies and senior officials to reduce their staff from its original strength of 260 to 59 by fiscal year 2015. And that has raised serious concerns as to whether that office's mission of security cooperation can be adequately carried out. All of those proposed cuts come at a time of escalating violence in Iraq and serious reports of human rights violations and abuses of power by Prime Minister Maliki, not to mention Iraq's national parliamentary elections that are scheduled for next year, which will determine Iraq's next prime minister. In short, now is not the time to diminish America's capacity to influence events on the ground in Iraq. Finally, 2 years after the last troops came home, it is time for President Obama to articulate a clear long-term vision and strategy for peace in Iraq. 2 years ago, EPIC welcomed these words from President Obama. Quote, "We're partnering to strengthen the institutions upon which Iraq's democracy depends. Free elections, a vibrant press, a strong civil society, professional police and law enforcement that uphold the rule of law, an independent judiciary that delivers justice fairly, and transparent institutions that serve all Iraqis. If we are to become true friends of the people of Iraq, we must continue to pursue progress in all those areas. Iraq's leaders will not change overnight, but over time, through effective partnerships, educational exchanges, investments, and yes, in some cases, direct assistance, particularly in support of key institutions in civil society, Iraq will change for the better, producing better political, social, and economic outcomes for all Iraqis. And with that, we can truly mark an end to this war." In the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, "It isn't enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it. One must work at it." This has been Erik Gustafson with our first Iraq Matters commentary. Hello, this is Erik Gustafson with Iraq Matters, doing this special podcast for Veterans Day, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guests. We have 3 Iraq War veterans who are joining our program today. So I'd like to have them introduce themselves. We'll just do a round robin. Go ahead, David.
Hello, my name's David. I was a former summer intern at EPIC. Currently, I am an undergrad student at UC Davis. Right now, I'm actually in the 24-hour study room. You can see a bunch of students being studious and studying for their midterms and or working on papers. I was in Iraq twice, once in 2008 in Anbar. I was in the Army, but attached to the Marines. And for most of that tour, I was doing missions in Fallujah and a few in Karma, which is east of Fallujah, or locally known as Garma. It has both of those names, Karma or Garma. The second tour was in Basra in 2011, and I was there up until the withdrawal.
Christopher?
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm actually currently in EPIC's office. I'm an intern for the fall, completing a graduate certificate for James Madison in International Nonprofit Management. I was in the Army, and I served in Iraq in 2004-2005, and I was there for the surge in 2007, with both of my tours being in the city of Ar Ramadi, which is...
Excellent. And Lynn?
Hi, my name is Lynn Schneider, and I served in Iraq 3 tours. The first 2 tours were outside of Baghdad in 2004, 5, and 7. I had a civil affairs team the first tour. Second tour was a strategy planner for the non-kinetic side of the surge, and I served both those tours with the same individuals, actually, which was quite interesting. And then the third tour, I served as a DoD senior civilian in Basra. I was the economic advisor to the commanding general in 2010.
So I'm going to run through 3 questions for all of you. The first question, starting with David, is what do you remember most about your time in Iraq?
There are a few things that I remember, but the 2 things that stand out are the camaraderie that I have with those whom I'm deployed with. It's something hard to explain. Deploying and coming home with a bunch of guys, you hear it in the movies all the time. They say things like, we're closer than brothers, but it actually is. But more so relating to Iraq and not towards us, just the human spirit in general. Iraqis, they've gone through, ever since Saddam invaded Iran in 1980, they've gone through pretty much 30 years of continuous war, yet they're still able to continue to live on their life, go to work, go to school, and, try to be normal human beings.
Christopher?
Just to build off of what David said, as far as the Iraqis and their humanity, there's their humility. After serving in Iraq for about 3 months, we were moved to Ar Ramadi, and we had about a month and a half to 2 months of just heavy fighting. And eventually, after the fighting kind of died down, we would go into basically some houses on a patrol or whatnot, and they would just offer us fistfuls of bread, rice, chai. It just seemed like they kind of appreciated what we were doing.
And Lynn?
Yeah, I remember, I have to agree with David also with the military camaraderie. You make friends for life. There's something about being in a war zone together that not only bonds people together, but I think changes you for the rest of your life. And the second thing that I would like to mention is what I remember, and it still exists today actually, is the extreme poverty and the lack of infrastructure among the local Iraqi populations. But nonetheless, there is an enormous amount of kindness, and the people really have an enormous amount of courage. And so those are the things that really stand out.
Definitely, I'm hearing themes about, you'll go to many areas of Iraq where the hospitality is almost legendary. So the next question I have for all of you, you have to kind of think back to the time before you deployed to Iraq. How did your perceptions of Iraq and the U.S. mission in Iraq change with your experience on the ground there?
My perception before I got to Iraq that it was just one giant war zone, similar to every day would be a day like D-Day in World War II. When we flew from Kuwait to Al-Assad Air Base, which is in western Anbar. And I thought right when we landed on the C-130 that we were going to get mortared, we're going to get shot at. So I remember getting off the C-130 and I'm like ducking my head, getting like, okay, where's it going to come from? When in reality, the only thing I was dodging was the hot air from the C-130 because nothing was coming down. So that was my first perception, is that it was literally just going to be violent every single day. And then once I started doing missions, I thought that, for instance, like I said, I went to Fallujah, which was previously the worst area in Karma too, because Karma was kind of an area in between Fallujah and Baghdad. That was like a resting zone. Those two areas, along with Ramadi and a handful of others, were among the worst fighting ever since Vietnam. So I thought in Fallujah, everyone was going to hate us, but that wasn't the case. Similar to what Chris said about the hospitality, I vividly remember one foot patrol we were doing. A little Iraqi boy comes out of his house with a bowl full of dates that they probably grew in their house, because the way that it works is like there's like 2 or 3 story houses, and they would have walls that were about 5 feet high with little gates. So the little Iraqi boy comes running out his gate with a bowl of dates for us, and he gave it to all of us as we walked by. So I perceived that things were a lot worse than they were, and that they all hated us, when in reality they didn't. There was a lot who liked us, there were a lot who wanted us there, but granted there were a lot who didn't want us there. Sometimes on my first tour in Fallujah, there would be instances where the air just seemed thick with anger, and same with in Basra. When I did certain missions in Basra, if it was in a neighborhood that was basically owned by a militia, you can just sense their absolute hatred towards you. In my experience, that was the minority of the time, not the majority of the time.
And Christopher, what about your time in Iraq?
I would say my experience was a little bit different from David's. I was actually an 11 Bravo, or an infantryman, so I was basically trained to fight. And when we got the orders that we were going to Iraq, we looked at it as, hey, we get to do our job. And everybody, quoted their favorite line from Black Hawk Down and all that crazy stuff. And it was just like, this is going to be awesome because we get to do our job. And I had the misfortune of being one of the first people to actually lose a best friend. We were conducting a mission around Fallujah, and that was actually part of our AO at one point, was just doing missions around Fallujah to kind of get rid of the surplus of arms. Well, he ended up getting shot and killed, and he was the first casualty for my battalion. And kind of right there, I just had a huge reality check. Death can really come forever, and this isn't something that you should be enthralled about or enthusiastic about. It should be something that you should really kind of think about and say, if I make a mistake, somebody's going to get killed. And by the end of my first tour, I was pretty much, I hate Iraqis. Iraqis are just these horrible people. They just don't want us there. They just want to kill us. And my opinion changed a great deal when I was basically put onto a military transition team which basically serves to advise the Iraqi army on how to do things better, how to conduct missions and convoys, and just your basic everyday kind of infantry stuff.
This was your second tour in Iraq, is that right?
Yes, this was 2007.
Okay.
And I was actually placed on a mid-team with a bunch of Marines. So late in my tour, I was actually put on a detail to set up a forward operating base with basically 50-something Iraqi soldiers and one other American for maybe the first 2 weeks. And kind of the ironic thing about Iraqis, they think about things a little bit different than us. We think about force protection when we move into a new area. We're thinking about sandbagging everything. And the first thing they thought about was satellite TV. And they hooked up the TV, and sure enough, that night, within maybe 10 minutes, we were watching the Arab TV that they have on for that area. And they said that the other choice was British TV, but we ended up watching TV for several nights in a row. And at one point in time, I just completely forgot that I was sitting with a group of Iraqis who were just all enjoying ourselves and just laughing at the movie and just having a good time.
Nice. Just hanging out with the guys.
Yep.
Lynn?
Yeah, I want to give a thoughtful response because my tour, I had 3 tours that spanned across odd changes in the mission set. So my first tour, of course, we didn't really have, we just thought everything was, as David had said, everything was just constant fighting and war on the ground. And we flew straight from Fort Bragg in a C-5 to land near Baghdad. And, of course, it was the middle of the night, it was dark. The plane does its combat landing, and so we had no idea. I'll have to admit to you, I had no idea what was going to happen when we hit the ground. So anyway, from there, of course, you do tours and you take on a military mindset. I want to kind of give a visual to people who are listening what the streets of Baghdad are like, at least in 2004 and 2007, and I believe somewhat still today. It's very dirty. People do not have heat in their homes. They still lack electricity. So there's no refrigeration or very little of it. What lights they do have, they have either run by generators or when the power does come on, of course, and they use that. But it's very dirty, and there were many times that we rode through sewage that went to the top of the wheels of the Humvees for long periods of time. It wasn't like it was fixed quickly. So I think the transition on one side of the spectrum was we were there to first start to help the people get back on their feet, sort of stabilize the population. And then in 2007, of course, it turned towards security and shifting towards helping the government get up and running to have some sort of a consistent policy bit coming out of Baghdad towards the local Iraqi population. And then, of course, what we were going to do with the insurgency. And then my last tour, again, was trying to help the people bring back hope to the population and trying to develop the economy, which was lacking. So as I walk through those stages, I want people to understand that the living conditions are still not any better. So think of the dirt. When you walk, there's dust. In the winter, or when it rains, the dust and the dirt turn to gumbo, so it sticks to everything, your shoes, your combat boots, I mean everything. So it's quite a drastic change between summer and winter. The people are cold. There's no heat. There's no windows on most of the houses. The houses are made from clay. And so how did my perceptions change? Well, going from helping the local population in 2004 and 5 and in 7, again, I had no idea what the Iraqi people were like. We weren't really given much information because everything that we read was everything that was under Saddam Hussein. And so you pictured a population that came back from 3 or 4 times, back from shock and people were scared, to vestiges of hope, and then they were shocked and scared again, and they came back to vestiges of hope. So how does it change? Their people are really strong. I mean, the Iraqi people are really strong people. And with every year that goes by, I think that my perception of their ability to come out of this on the leading edge is quite positive.
I have something to add, actually.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Similar to how she was comparing her different tours, mine were over different spans, but also different areas. The PIC, which stands for Provincial Iraqi Control, happened in Anbar while I was there. So we transferred from basically doing missions unilaterally, which was by ourselves, to doing missions with them, teaching them how to do it to the point to where they could do it. So I went after COIN, which is counterinsurgency, was implemented. So I didn't see Iraq before counterinsurgency. I saw after, and to me it worked. And one big difference between my first and my second tour was the fact that the Iraqis had taken over. So in the first one, we were leading patrols with them behind us, and then they were leading patrols with us behind them. And then my second tour, we needed their permission to do stuff, unless if it was, say, counter indirect fire. And then secondly, something that Lynn said reminded me about the sewage. It was the same in Fallujah. So imagine you're walking down a sidewalk in some United States city, and there's a sidewalk on each side of the road, but the road itself is just caked with sewage. So you have to walk on the sidewalk to avoid the sewage, and the sewage is like the height of the sidewalk. So if the sidewalk is tall, the sewage is like 6 inches high. But about perceptions, something that I guess maybe people can relate to is the first mission I did in Fallujah. It reminded me of pictures I'd seen in World War II of bombed out Berlin. So that's what the place looked like.
Yeah, all of you are speaking about many things, like about the poverty. I think the estimates are around 25% of Iraqis live under the poverty line. So even though it's a country that has tremendous oil wealth, there's still a large segment of the population that is living below poverty, as well as Iraqis that are displaced.
Right. And the thing that really attracted me to EPIC is, helping the youth. And every single mission, I was surrounded by kids who would come running out of the house and say, Mr. Toba Toba, which means like ball, give me ball, or chocolate, something like this. And I was just amazed at how small these houses were and how many kids came running out. And then you're like, okay, where are the parents? Like the uncle or the dad was killed in the Iran-Iraq war. Then you have the older brother was killed. Maybe he fought us, or maybe he was in the Iraqi police and he fought with us. So the amount of men who are caring for children and the quantity of orphans / kids who only have one parent, well, the quantity of men is low who are caring, and the quantity of kids is very high, which places a giant burden on the women.
Yeah, the thing about the women, though, too, I want to make note is that before Saddam Hussein, they had an enormous amount of freedom. If you look at pictures of Iraq before Saddam Hussein, it was almost like the Leave It to Beaver series, right? People were out in the parks picnicking. They wore the same clothes as we did. They had, the same vehicles. And then the women were oppressed. The men were obviously everybody was living in fear. And then when we freed Iraq in 2003 and over 2004, you have to look at the visual signs. The women didn't have to wear headscarves, right? They were free not to walk around without headscarves, and the children were able to move around more freely. In 2007, when I returned, I noticed that the women were forced to cover up. They had to wear headscarves. They were wearing long skirts or pants, but it was clearly a visual change. So you could see that the fear had returned. I'm not sure, in 2010 it was the same way, and now I see pictures of people that we're working with there it has stayed that way. So there still is an amount of oppression that didn't exist prior to Saddam Hussein, and that they had a small amount of freedom which they tasted. And I think it's really important that we continue to work with the children and the women, because they are the major vestiges of change on the ground. And if you want to see change come, that's where it's going to come from. We need to invest in the future, specifically the children.
And there are, of course, some areas of Iraq, some of the cities that are more cosmopolitan, where there's a little bit more openness, but certainly in areas where you have certain militias in control, religious authorities exerting their authority, it really has kind of turned the clocks back in many ways.
Well, the government's allowing it. I mean, we need to be honest about that, too. Up in the Kurdish area, of course, people are free to wear whatever they like, within reason, conservative, but they don't have to cover up. And they're free to engage in business and commerce, and education programs up there are quite extensive. They have a lot of tourism, and I've been there several times as a private citizen versus from Kirkuk South. It's quite different.
My final question for everybody, and this of course can lead to other conversation, starting with you, David. As an Iraq War veteran looking back, what legacy would you like to leave behind in Iraq?
The legacy that I would like is that the blood and treasure that we spent there not be wasted, And then the way that it won't be wasted is for Iraq to be successful, both economically and democratically. If we look at Germany and Korea, whom we fought against them in World War II and the Korean War, both those countries are part of the OECD now, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. World War II vets can look back at Japan. World War II vets can look at either Japan or Germany and say, hey, I helped to create a country which is among the most economically powerful and among the most democratically free countries in the world. And then same with the Korean War vets. Right now, we can't really say that too much. So I hope that all the money we spent and all the lives that we lost and all the many more lives that were lost on their behalf will not have been for waste.
Christopher?
I mean, I'm right there with David. I had Iraqi friends. I had American friends. I lost a lot more Iraqi friends than I did American friends. And to give an idea, we had two VBIDs hit our control point between our two camps that straddled the main MSR, and they killed like over 70 people between the two. I mean, that's just counting the Iraqis. That's not that served with us, not the civilians. I mean, you couldn't really tell how many, but I think Iraq is definitely owed a prosperous time, a peaceful time, a time of stability, and just a time just to move past everything that's been happening for like the last decade plus. And I think the major thing that's moving forward, like with what David was saying, is if you want to say why Iraq matters or why we should care about Iraq, then we should look at Germany after World War I, where they basically had no support, nobody backing them up, and they were just surrounded by hostile entities, and they just were really going at them, and that democracy just deteriorated. You have the same thing that happened in Russia in '91 when they went post-communist. Nobody really tried to help them out, and they were basically isolated, and we wonder why they're slipping back into their communist kind of mentality of just the government is right and just do what we tell you. And certainly there's been several people and critics over the past couple of weeks that have noted that Iraq is dangerously going towards a totalitarian kind of mindset with criticisms of just how Prime Minister Maliki is running things in Iraq and the conditions that Obama gave Maliki this past Friday, where he said basically you need to execute good governance, you need to pass an election law, and you need to make it more inclusive for continued support. So I think for both entities, we need to start moving forward and working and cooperating, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a failure in Iraq. I think that's still to be determined. And granted, the fight is harder now because we're no longer there with boots on the ground, but it's not a failure. It's a ways away from being a failure.
There's still opportunities to make a difference. Lynn, what legacy do you hope we'll leave behind in Iraq?
No, I think that was a very thoughtful follow-up. I have to agree with both David and Chris. I also would like to see a unified Iraq where the separation of the Sunni, Shia, Christian, and other faiths come back together like they were in the past, and that they work together to help their country. And I think we do owe it to them. The way we left was quite stark, and I think that we do owe it to them to continue to help.
The only other thing I just want to ask really quickly, each of you are continuing your service in many different ways. Can you just briefly talk about what you're doing now that connects with helping Iraqis, whether they're refugees being resettled or helping through charitable work?
Right now, as I said earlier, in the summer, I was an intern at EPIC. So I was working with EPIC in order to help implement plans and projects in Iraq to help specifically the youth. Currently, because I'm in California and not in Washington, D.C., it's kind of hard to intern at EPIC. So I was able to get an internship at the IRC, which is the International Rescue Committee, and currently assisting in helping many Iraqis resettle in the United States, Iraqi refugees and SIVs.
Christopher?
As I said earlier, I'm actually here completing a international nonprofit management graduate certificate through JMU. I actually found EPIC through their current campaign on IraqMatters.com through Thunderclap, actually, and I just happened to be looking at Thunderbird. And I thought this was exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to have some kind of catharsis and have some kind of positive impact on Iraq and Iraqis, even if it is just a support role back in the United States.
And Lynn?
Yeah, I still have many Iraqi friends, as many of us do, and I wanted to continue to help after I left. One thing that I enjoy doing is private sector economic development, and so I've been over working on my own with individuals there to expand that. I've worked with some of the nuns, helping to set up some private sector clinics that serve everyone, and we're going to continue with that. Several medical missions that we work to provide pharmaceutical supplies and sort of a Doctors Without Borders effort. And then also I'm helping with the Iraq Children's Foundation to work with street children and orphans in Iraq.
That's the Sponsor Iraqi Children Foundation with Jonathan and with Cindy.
We just changed the name. We dropped the word sponsor, but it's the Iraq Children's Foundation with Jonathan. Yeah, great group. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, and I do want to give a shout out to a couple folks. Jonathan Webb, who is also with the Iraqi Children's Foundation. He wasn't able to join us, but he's been amazing and doing great work with that organization. And then also Rick Burns with the Karada Project, another Iraq War veteran. So one of the things that is such an honor with this work and with EPIC's mission is connecting with so many Americans and Iraqis that are continuing to try to make a difference on the ground there. So thank you, all of you, for your service and for your continued sense of mission and everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, Eric.
To respond to recent emails, tweets, and comments from you, our listeners. This is Chelsea, and I'm here with Mary.
Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, Mary. So first, we'd like to respond to a tweet that we received from @HamzaHaddad, who said, "Your description says, promoting peace and democracy in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. You know Iraq means all 18 provinces." That's an interesting observation, Hamza.
As a quick background for all of our listeners, some of you may not know that the Iraq Matters podcast is a program of EPIC, the Education for Peace in Iraq Center. EPIC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and Hamza's tweet is referencing our mission. EPIC is committed to lasting peace and empowering youth in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan.
And our mission applies to all 18 provinces of Iraq. But to answer Hamza's point, we specifically say Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan for a few reasons. First of all, Iraqi Kurdistan is autonomous. And secondly, in terms of our field work, we've experienced more cooperation in the north, and we hope that Iraqi Kurdistan will be the starting point to expand our field work into the rest of Iraq.
Yes, Chelsea. And Hamza also tweeted to us, "I know it's easier for cooperation with the autonomous north, but this kind of language doesn't help Iraqi unity. Having said that, I appreciate the work you and your organization has put in and continue to put into Iraq." We appreciate hearing from you very much, Hamza. We want to thank you for tweeting to us, and we're always happy to hear all types of feedback.
Now, in response to our last podcast, episode 6, which featured an interview with Iraq analyst Ahmed Ali about Prime Minister Maliki's visit to Washington, we heard from a lot of listeners.
Yeah, it was our biggest response ever to any episode, wasn't it?
Yeah, we received over 40 comments via our post on Facebook, most of which were deeply critical of Prime Minister Maliki.
And in addition, EPIC received an email from Adnan in Baghdad, who was critical of the meeting between Obama and Maliki. And he wrote to us, "Dear Sir, the meeting with the Prime Minister will never change anything because he is sure the U.S. will not send any soldier to Iraq. So he will make the elections like Saddam just to give him an excuse to continue in his job as Prime Minister. Iran supports him, and the U.S. was supporting him in his position. Anyway, we did not know what happened in the White House. I think the car bombing will increase because al-Maliki wants to stay in his position. It is an opinion that I hear here in Iraq. Kind regards."
Thank you for your email, Adnan, and thanks to everyone else who responded to us via Facebook. We really appreciate hearing all different kinds of opinions from our listeners.
I think we should start by recognizing that Adnan raised an important point about U.S. military intervention, but to realize that realistically, military intervention in the future is not going to happen.
Well, that's a really good point, but there are definitely other ways that the U.S. can still be involved in supporting Iraq's young democracy and making its government as transparent and accountable as possible. The best method for doing this is through diplomacy.
You know, at Iraq Matters, we share Adnan's concerns that the U.S. is not doing enough to reduce violence and is doing too little too late.
Yeah, and to address the criticisms of Maliki specifically, we hope that our position is clear that we don't support any particular political party or figure in Iraq, and instead we promote a relationship between the U.S. and Iraq and a focus on Iraq's institutions and processes. We will continue our efforts to press the Obama administration and Congress to do more. You can help us in pursuing that goal through our petition at www.iraqmatters.org.
Thanks, Adnan, for emailing to us. We really appreciate that you took the time to do that. And thanks again to Hamse and to everyone who posted on Facebook. We really love to hear from all of our listeners. So if you want to write to us about any of the topics on today's podcast, or really on any topic having to do with Iraq, you can write to us at info@epic-usa.org. You can reach us on Facebook, or you can tweet to us at Enabling Peace.
This has been Iraq Matters, an epic podcast of news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to thank our guests, David Slater, Christopher Sullivan, and Lynn Schneider. As we celebrate Veterans Day, we wish to also thank them and all veterans for their service and for their continuing sense of mission. If you or your organization or business are interested in supporting the Iraq Matters podcast, let us know by calling us at 202-682-0208 or emailing us at info@epic-usa.org. This is Chelsea, reminding you and friends around the world that Iraq matters.